acknowledging the contribution of our forefathers who have helped in creating a world based on freedom and human dignity. I extend my respect to people of diverse cultures, faith, color, and genders, and pledge to work for equity, inclusivity, peace, and harmony. Good evening to one and all present here. I, Christina Shajan, a first-year student of DME Media School, welcome you to the 5th edition of the world's first 7-day hybrid international media conference, ICAN5. The International Media Conference, ICAN5, is being organized by DME Media School of Delhi Metropolitan Education in collaboration with the School of Communication and Creative Arts, Deakin University, Melbourne, Australia. I would like to take a moment and introduce Delhi Metropolitan Education to our audience. Delhi Metropolitan Education is an A-grade premier educational institute affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University, New Delhi, and approved by the Bar Council of India. DME Media School is one of the most promising media institutes in the country. It offers BA in journalism and mass communication. It is recognized as a school focused on the growth of its faculty and students through academic and co-curricular activities. ICAN5 has come with a theme, inclusivity, convergence, and alternative negotiation with hashtag communication for all. ICAN5 has the support of 17 partners, including the International Association of Media and Communication Research, Gender and Communication Section, IMCR, Gen Section, and GMEC, Global Media Education Council as the conference partner. Knowledge partners for ICAN5 are Makhanlal Chaturvedi University, Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, Vigyan Prasar, Government of India, and Keshav Suri Foundation. For ICAN5, international partners are Institute for International Journalism, Ohio University, USA, Green University, Bangladesh, and the Fordham International University, Bangladesh. Media partners for ICAN5 are Amar Ujala, The Policy Times, Jai Hind Times, and the Hindi Post. ICAN5 is powered by Asian Media and Cultural Studies Network, Australia, Australia-India Film Practitioners and Researchers Network, SPARK, the Student Council of DME Media School, and RIM, Research and Innovation in Media, Research Cell of DME. The conference is supported by NATO, National Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. Since 2018, DME Media School has been organizing the international conference ICAN. The themes for the former editions were India and Changing Aspects of News, ICAN1, Indian Cinema and Alternate Networks in ICAN2, Issues of Community, Agenda and News in ICAN3, Information Communication and Artificial Networks in ICAN4, Inclusivity, Convergence and Alternative Negotiations, ICAN5. ICAN5 will witness a total of 26 sessions, including 18 live sessions, 5 hybrid sessions, and 3 physical sessions. The schedule comprises of 10 technical sessions, 3 workshops, 2 masterclasses, and 2 plenary sessions, and 5 panel discussions. Proud to mention here that all technical sessions are being chaired by women scholars representing different states and countries. It gives me immense pleasure that ICAN5 will go live on the official Facebook page of DME for various sessions. For more information, follow us on our social media handles. We are sharing the links in the chat box. Now, I invite Professor Dr. Amrish Saxena, Dean DME Media School and convener of ICAN5 to give his opening remarks for the session.
I begin today by acknowledging the contribution of our forefathers who have helped in creating a world based on freedom and human dignity. I extend my respect to people of diverse culture, faith, color, and gender, and pledge to work for equity, inclusivity, peace, and harmony. I welcome everybody in the third session of day 2. We started this 5th edition of ICAN conference last evening only, amidst the galaxy of scholars from all parts of the world. And this morning we had 2 technical sessions, 1 master class, and this is the last session of the day. And we are happy to note that in this session, Professor Jyotika Ramaprasad has kindly agreed to be with us. She is too busy. She is a researcher of fame, and she has been involved in so many teaching assignments and research assignment, but still she was kind enough to be with us this evening. Obviously, this is her morning, and that too on this weekend. But then we are having her here. And the topic, because the theme for this year of ICAN conference, the focus is on inclusivity. So we are trying to bring a lot of such sub themes which are which are somewhere gelling with the main theme. And for this reason, we have tried to include this time to more nations in our neighborhood. So it's a conference which is representing the entire Indian subcontinent, because Bangladesh universities, Pakistan universities, and scholars from both the countries are here with us. So as we were discussing with Professor Jyotika with regard to various topics for this session, so finally we zeroed in on the communication of the indigenous people. And as I have requested her to pick up such kind of things which are more having more reference to South Asia, in particular to Indian subcontinent, so that it becomes more relevant for the audience which is there. This audience mainly comprising the students of journalism and mass communication of DME Media School. There are students from other institutions, and also the media scholars from other institutions also. So we are trying to make it more representative in terms of delivery, in terms of participation, so that it can be beneficial to all of us who are coming from different backgrounds, but finally we have converged at one place, and there is a common quest that we all are trying to know something new, something more, all such knowledge which is to the benefit of the society, and which can help us all to grow and to have a dignified life. And communication in any case is the core thing when we talk about journalism and mass communication, or any aspect of journalism and mass communication. Communication is in the core. So but then there are certain areas in communication which are hardly looked at. So this topic which Professor Jyotika has chosen, the indigenous people's communication, so this will give the communication a different dimension, and we will be knowing many things which earlier either we would not had heard of, or we would not have actually noticed the way we should have noticed. So all communicators who are there in this session, so this is going to be a class in the real sense, wherein some addition to our existing learning is to be there. So thank you, Professor Jyotika. Thank you all the participants who are there in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm happy to share that Journalism at DME is the official newsletter of DME Media School. This fortnightly publication covers all the major activities happening in and out of the campus. It is a student-centric newsletter carried out entirely by them under the supervision of faculty members. DME TV is the official YouTube channel where you can find the playlist related to all the sessions, lecture series, film festivals, and conferences. Today, we have gathered here for the Masterclass 2 on the topic Indigenous Peoples Communication, with focus on South Asia and covering Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Before we proceed, I would request Dr. Manasvi Maheshwari, Associate Professor, DME Media School, to share profile the guest.
Thank you, Christina. I feel immense pleasure in introducing and welcoming Professor Jyotika Ramaprasad. She is professor in the School of Communication at University of Miami, USA. She is a noted academician and researcher. Previously, she had held positions of administrative responsibility as associate and interim dean at Southern Illinois University. Her earlier research focused on news flow, media representation, and advertising. Her recent interests are in journalism studies and social and behavioral change communication. Almost all of Professor's past and current work is international in orientation, spanning Africa, Asia, and Europe. She has also been a Fulbright Scholar at an Indian Institute of Communication and a Fulbright Specialist in Germany and South Africa. Professor has been part of two major collaborative projects, the BRICS Media System Project funded by Academy of Finland and Worlds of Journalism Study funded from various sources. Professor Ramaprasad has provided consulting help to a group of journalism communication educators from 5 East African countries for their environmental journalism, social change curriculum, and has in some cases under the auspices of the state department grants advised several educational institutions in Africa and Asia. We are honored to have such a visionary and researcher of excellence with us today. And now I request our expert to take this session forward from here. Over to you, ma'am.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you so much to Professor Saxena and Professor Maheshwari for inviting me to talk to all of you. I would like this to be a conversation rather than a lecture. So I hope you will please, interrupt me, ask me questions and so on, because that's really my style of giving talks or of conversing in a classroom, excuse me. And I want to start with, apart from thanking you, your university, and all of you for attending, I want to start with saying that I'm absolutely delighted that this theme for this particular year's ICAN is inclusivity and diversity. I cannot emphasize to all of you enough how important it is to be inclusive, to respect all cultures, all religions, all people. We all, are human beings. And I think we need to understand that just as we like to be respected, others like to be respected too, and be considered human beings. And so I'm absolutely want to commend your university for having this particular theme for your ICAN conference. One of the things I would like to start with saying is that in the United States and in some of the other countries, whenever we do a talk that is particularly, it may not be about indigeneity, but when we do a talk, generally, if our university took the land of indigenous people and built on it, we always acknowledge that the land on which we stand and on which our university stands belonged to this particular indigenous group of people. So that's a way of thanking those people, because we actually grabbed the land from them, right? I mean, that's true in Australia, it's true in Canada, it's true in the United States. And so we start with that acknowledgement that the land on which our university stands belongs to a particular indigenous group. And this is also true for the University of Miami. We have the Seminole tribe in the area in which the university is located, and we are standing on their land. They were kind of pushed out of the land, and the whole of Florida was built basically on tribal land, So I want to acknowledge that my university also stands on the land of a group of tribal people. The other thing I would like to say, and you will figure that out when I do the presentation, is this is a totally new topic for me also. And I'll give you in my presentation an idea of how I got interested and how I'm exploring the topic. And I hope that will be an incentive to all of you also to look into indigeneity in South Asia and to begin to study this in your attempt at inclusivity. And so I will tell you about my interest and how it led me to this particular topic, which I'm just beginning to explore. So I don't stand here as an expert on indigenous people and their communication, but just as somebody who would like to share what I'm discovering and what I'm exploring. All right. So it's possible there are people in the audience who know a lot more than me about the topic. So please feel free to jump in. All right. So I'm going to share my presentation. And I can tell you one thing that I would like, Maheshwari, Dr. Maheshwari, if you don't mind, will you monitor the chat? Because when I give a talk, I'm so involved in what I'm saying that I don't look at the chat. So if there are questions or anything, please, if you could help me to monitor the chat, I would appreciate it. All right, so let me share screen. Okay, so, obviously I'm a faculty member at the School of Communication at the University of Miami. And I joined the university largely because the position that they advertised was about social change, about using communication for social change. And that is really a passion of mine, of how we can help groups of people who are marginalized, who for some reason have been oppressed. And this is true all over the world. And I really wanted to work on how we can use communication in that particular field of work. And so I've done projects in many parts of the world that deal with this, but today is not the day to talk about it. I'm hoping that in the future that I can really work with Indigenous peoples in India and maybe do a project there to use communication to work on a social justice issue. So how did I become interested in this particular topic? So I am very interested in global cultures. As you heard in my introduction, I travel all over the world. I have worked in many, many parts of the world. And I love different cultures, and I try to take them at their value without any kind of judgment. So one of the courses I teach is intercultural communication. And I thought that in that course, I should ask my students to do an assignment that deals with Indigenous people. And hang on one second. So this is, I obviously have misplaced that assignment, but anyway, I had a slide on that assignment and I have, by mistake, probably deleted it. But the slide basically showed you what my assignment was. And if you want to hear about it later, I'll be happy to talk about it. But this was not a course simply on communication, but it's also on culture. And so I said, find an Indigenous group of people, understand their culture and their epistemology. So that is where I'm also going to start the discussion today about the difference in the epistemology of the scientific world and the Indigenous people. And I'll explain what epistemology is in a moment. But because I got interested in this topic, I kind of looked for opportunities where I could get involved within my university with people who are interested in Indigenous cultures. And so luckily, it just so happened that the semester in which I was teaching and I asked my students to do this project, I came across a university news item in their university newsletter, which said that there had been a new group that was formed in the College of Arts and Sciences that was going to talk about, that was interested in Native American and global Indigenous cultures. And I kind of just want to show you their website because it might provide all of you who are in different universities to think about doing something like this. So hopefully this link is going to work and you'll be able to see their website. Can you see that? Please give me a heads up. Yeah. Yes. So this is the Native American and Global Indigenous Studies group, which was just formed 2 years ago, actually. And we make it a point always to acknowledge, as I said, where we stand, right? And so it explains to you what is this group, what is NAGIS, and it has just begun. We just actually had a big search for a new faculty member, and we had like 120 applicants, all of them absolutely excellent from all over the world. And so we have several courses. I developed a course for them, which parts of which I will show you if you want to develop a course in Indigenous communication. And then they talk about different events. They have many different talks, resources, and stuff like that. So if you want to explore this website as a way of possibly starting something, may not be immediately, but later, starting something that specializes in Indigenous people and maybe in their communication. So I kind of just wanted to share this with you for a moment. So this is how I developed a course in Indigenous communication. And I began to think, I spent about 10 to 15 days totally immersed in the literature. And this is again a suggestion I would like to share with you on that you really have to go into the literature and immerse in it. I spent like 15 days just totally immersing in the literature. I went into Google Scholar, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and I kept looking, putting in different keywords and finding as much literature as I could. And some of the topics I'm going to talk about today in today's talk is the topics that you see listed here. Now, these are not all the topics that I cover in my course, but we don't have the time to talk about all of them. And so these are some of the topics that you could consider if you're developing courses or you're teaching intercultural communication. You might pick up one or two of these topics and get students interested in one or two of these topics. So the first thing I want to talk about is the ethics of research. So when you do research with Indigenous people, the first thing I want to talk about is I want to share this resource with you, okay? This book is focused on South Asia, all right? Now, if you go to Google Scholar, you may not find a lot of work on South Asia. And there may be a lot of work on South Asia's Indigenous people, but maybe even languages that are not covered by Google Scholar. So I spent like a whole day looking for literature on Indigenous people in South Asia, and it was really difficult to come up with much on it. But here is a book that, that will be a really good resource if you become interested in this topic. And it deals with communication and media, and it is about South Asia. And I marked several passages in it, but I don't think that we will absolutely get time to go through all of that. But I will talk about some of the ideas, all right? So I would suggest this reference book to you. So going back to the topic that I wanted to talk about, research ethics. So one of the key things that I would like to talk about, and please feel free to ask questions in chat, is that when we do research with any group of people, particularly if we are doing it for the aim of helping the community in terms of social change, we have to make sure that the community participates, all right? Because if we come in as an outside expert and we go in and we impose our ideas on the community, we are looking at the community from our point of view rather than from their point of view. And if you really want to understand a community, you have to understand it from their point of view, right? So it's really critical that you have them participate. And this is very doable if you're using qualitative methods, right? Because you can do in-depth interviews, you can do focus groups, and you can have them talk to you in a much more nuanced and detailed way. If you're doing quantitative research, I would recommend to you that develop the questionnaire with their input. Use the language that they are used to, right? Ask them to look over your questions, whether it makes sense or not, all right? So that we don't completely interpret their being, who they are from our perspective. So that's one particular thing that I wanted to mention. And the other thing is, we as researchers go into communities, and what do we give back to them? We come back, we get our paper, or we give talks, or we, rise in our profession. What does that community get, right? We need to think about that. They gave us a lot when they gave us information, right? Did we leave anything behind for that community? Did we go back and say, we will come back and maybe talk to your children about something? Or we will, if you have these particular problems, we will go talk to an NGO, or we will go and see what we can at the local government level, talk about issues that this community faces. There's something we can do always in return. And this is not meant to be if you give me this, I will do this. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about it from the ethical point of view, all right? So these are, there are many other things we can talk about in this respect, but these are the two things that I wanted to make sure that I leave with you today, that when you do, and I hope you do, may not be immediately, but future, a lot of young people in the audience today, and as you pursue your careers, I hope in the future, when you decide that you want to study an Indigenous community and their communication or their culture, that you keep some of these things in mind, right? So this is where I start talking about actually the substance of this talk. And that is that in almost all over the world, we have dealt what I would call epistemic and representational violence against indigenous communities. Okay, what does that mean? Well, what representation violence is pretty easy to understand. Representational violence is the idea that we represent them in our terms, right? I mean, think about any nation. What did we call our tribal communities, right? We call them backward classes. They were primitive. They were backward. These are labels that we have chosen to give them, right? Are they really backward? Today, we're realizing that the way they take care of their environment, excuse me, we have a lot to learn from them. We are the people who are backward. We've destroyed our environment, right? The environment has been destroyed by human beings. And these human beings are the people who call themselves civilized, including myself, okay? I blame myself too, right? So how have we represented these people? If you go back to any representation of people across the world, they were very, very derogatory representations of indigenous people around the world. And that we call representational violence. We committed violence against them by doing this. Because what do? We leave images about these people in other people's minds when we take a photograph of them, right? And that image then results in some kind of action. Oh, they're backward people. Oh, they don't know how to dress. They're not civilized. We need to civilize them, right? So that's something I really want to spend some time talking about. And then there is epistemic violence. So let's talk a little bit about epistemology. So epistemology, and I'm sorry if I'm explaining a term that all of you know, but just in case it is a new term for some of you, I just want to spend a minute explaining it. Epistemology is how do we know what we know, right? So we know what we know, maybe from what our parents told us, from what our schools told us, from what our books tell us, from what our movies tell us, from what our advertising tells us, right? This is how we know. But we in the scientific community, students and faculty members, we also know from research, right? And research has completely taken the position that the only valid research is scientific research, which is quantitative and which we call objective. Now, I want you to put on your thinking hat for a moment. Are we truly objective when we do research? We have already been taught how to do it. We take our biases when we do questionnaires. The very idea of the fact that there's a rational human being, that we are rational human beings, and that we are objective is committing violence against these people, right? Because we believe that the only kind of knowledge that's legitimate today is the knowledge that comes from the scientific model of positivism, of rationality, of objectivity, of separating nature from us. We cannot become part of nature. We shouldn't have emotion. We should be very rational and objective when we do our research. That is a Western model. That's a colonial model, right? That we inherited. It's a Western model. And we adopted it across the world. While indigenous people's way of knowing, or their epistemology, is a relational epistemology. Their epistemology, or their way of knowing, is based in their relationship with nature. It's based on how they live in nature and learn from nature, and how they respect nature, right? While we have been cutting forests down to build our big palaces and homes, right? We have not respected nature in many ways, right? We talk about animals invading our homes. Well, we took their land. This land belonged to those animals and those snakes and those hedgehogs, right? So epistemology is how do we know? And we need to constantly question ourselves on whether the way we know things is the only way to know things. Are there other ways of knowing things? And if you read the literature on indigenous epistemology, it is completely based on relationship with nature and respect for nature, and on unity and on community, right? So we have dismissed that as non-scientific. We have dismissed that is not the way to know. And so we have committed what we would call epistemic violence against indigenous people. Now, this is a colonial legacy, and it's true not only in our part of the world, but it's true in all over the world. If you go to Australia, you had the Aboriginal people who lived there. If you go to New Zealand, the Maori people lived there. The white people came in and took that land, and then decided that these people were uncivilized, and they took their children away from them to civilize them. There are fantastic movies and documentaries about this. The same thing happened in the United States, right? They took the land of the Native Americans and they called them violent. Who were the people who came with guns? It was the white people who came with guns. Now, we brown people cannot say, oh, we are good people too. We have done the same thing with our communities, right? So we cannot just blame other people, right? We need to question ourselves and see what have we done to take the land of our indigenous people, to deprive them of their way of living, right? To call them backward. Yeah. So we need to think about it not just as a colonial legacy, but as the idea of power, which is the second major idea that I want to leave with you. That power is an immensely important concept for us to think about. People have power of different levels, right? And we as researchers have the power to either commit epistemic or representational violence or to change things. We have that power, right? And similarly, the white people who came to these countries had the power and the guns. We, when the English colonized us, they were the ones who started creating, documenting tribes and so on. And they started this legacy of calling them, backward and native people and so on, right? And we continued that legacy for some time. Things are changing. Things changed at the United Nations in 1980, and that's how we've all become very conscious of what we have done to native people across the world. Yeah. So in 1980, the United Nations had a proclamation about the rights of indigenous people. And since 1980, in the last 40 years, there's been progress made. And now we have nonprofits, or what we call NGOs in our part of the world, doing a lot of work with these communities and trying to change things, right? So remember that power operates at lots of levels, at the level of conquest by white people, but also lies with us in the way we write about native people, the way we write about Aboriginal people, the way we write about tribal people. And in many parts of the world, they've begun to be called First Nation. So if you talk about Canada, they don't call them native people anymore. They call them First Nation, meaning that they were the first people to be living in this land. New Zealand does the same, right? They are the first people. Maybe we need to call them first people rather than tribal. So they came here before we came here. So think about words and what power our words have when we represent people, all right? So I have also tried to give a few articles that you can read, and I have actually linked to those articles, but I don't think we will get time to go into them because I marked things in those articles to show you. But I want to make sure I get through the lecture, and then I can, I can always share this and you can look up the articles yourself, right? So now one thing that we come from media and communication. So one thing that we are interested in is communication, right? How do First Nations, and I'm going to call them First People, how do they communicate, right? And how do we represent them? So we want to look at it from the point of communication. So one research area that's very, very rich and that can be pursued is how do First Nation people or First People communicate? And one of the things that we've destroyed to some extent, because we are so much into visual media today, is orality. These cultures were oral cultures, right? And so an orality was a way to communicate. I mean, if you go into Africa, and this is true in South Asia too, we had people who remembered the history for generations, and they would know who was your great, 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 great grandmother and grandfather and so on. They kept that history. They had no writing. They kept it in their minds. In Africa, these people are called griots, Griots. They carry, they're storytellers, and they carry the stories from generations before, and they're historians actually. And we give them no credit as historians because we believe historians have to have a degree and have to be objective, right? But these were the first historians, right? And they communicated orally. So orality is a very big part of the culture of these first people, right? And all the way through film and new media today, right? So you can actually explore so many different levels of communication, right? Now, one of the things that is happening in the world today, and also true in our part of the world, and I still remember when I was a very young child, my father was an army officer. And when I was a very young child, we went to Uttakamand. We lived in a town called Wellington in the Nilgiri Hills. It was a military establishment. And we were taken up into the hills because the very small tribe, and they have really diminished now, of the Toda people lived there. I don't know if you're familiar with the Toda people. They lived in the Nilgiri Hills. And we went there to watch them or listen to them sing, right? And now as an adult, and it still created an impression in my mind. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, and I still remember it because they were performing for us, right? So now all over the world, we use, quote, we use people of the first people of the world as performers in our tourism, right? And is that really the way we should be looking at these people? You know, adopt this very critical hat that first we oppress people around the world, and now for their livelihood, they perform in front of us because we've taken away their way of living, right? How do films represent them? How do new media represent them? These are all very, very rich areas for research, okay? And so here's yet another article. And again, as I said, in the interest of time, I will not open some of these articles right now. This is another article which talks about oral traditions and the cultural significance of storytelling in Samoa, okay? And I'm kind of a little, but you know what I can do is after I go through the talk, we'll come back and I'll open some of these articles. I think that will be a better way to do it. And the idea here being how important storytelling is. If any one of you, if you've been to Morocco, if you go to Marrakesh, there is a big square there in Marrakesh where storytellers sit there and they tell stories to local people. And this is today, right? Where we think new media is everything, right? But it isn't. You know, the world is not about new media. If you go to a lot of places, people don't have new media. So consider that these forms of communication are extremely important still, and we need to preserve them. And the government in Morocco decided that they were going to get rid of these storytellers because they wanted it to be the tourists to come and, you know, have a very lovely place for the tourists to come. And the local people rebelled. They said, we want our storytellers back. We want them there, right? So again, we dismiss storytelling, we dismiss orality as forms of communication that are unimportant. But they're still very important for a lot of people. And they're beautiful. And we need to celebrate them. So this is another great area for research around the world, that we can undertake. Okay. This article, maybe I should open. Uttaran Datta, I don't know if you know of him. He works in one of the universities in Arizona. And in fact, he's in India right now, in very remote tribal communities in the Northeast, doing research with indigenous people. And most of his work, so if you want to focus in on Indian first people, you should look at Uttaran Datta. I'm actually in touch with him, and he has sent photographs from these extremely remote areas where he's conducting his research. Here's another area that's really important. One of the biggest issues that we as communication people need to think about is how journalism represents people, right? How do news media represent people? This is an extremely critical area also. Generally, most journalists come from the upper middle class. In the past, most of them were male. And so there's a particular point of view that prevails in newsroom, right? We did not have first people in our newsrooms talking to us about their representation or reporting on them. We have all become very aware of the fact that we need females in the newsrooms, right? Because we were always getting a male perspective because they were mostly male journalists. Now we have so many female journalists in newsrooms, and they report on female issues from a female point of view. Why do we not have First Nation people? Why do we not get people from these communities also into the newsroom so that they can tell their stories from their point of view rather than a journalist like me or like Dr. Maheshwari who goes in, we go in with our PhDs and we have a point of view and we write about it from our point of view. They need to be telling their own stories, just like we want to be represented from our point of view. So this is another area that you can do a lot of policy work in. What are the educational opportunities for these people to come and get journalism training? What does DME do? Can DME do something to make sure that a few people from these communities come and get a training course in journalism so that they can do their own journalism? Can DME start something where they say, okay, we're going to do a joint video project about your community, and participation is important. You provide the cameras and the resources, and they help you to tell their story, right? So there are so many opportunities for us to do this, yeah? And so that we can help them, give them journalism training, let them tell their own stories. Go do a video production, but don't do it by yourself. Go into the community and let them help you do that production. You are just a technical person there. Let them tell their own stories in their own words, right? So this is really kind of important. And new media, all of the young people in this audience, I want to encourage all of you to use new media very responsibly, all right? All of you already know, you're in the field of communication, that there's lots of fake information out there. What are we doing as young communication media students to dispel that? What are we doing to make sure that this kind of misinformation about people is not circulating, at least in our own groups, right? Be an activist in this cause, right? When you see something, I mean, sometimes creates problems, right? You start having arguments with your friends, sometimes you have arguments with your own family because you say, this is not true. Why don't you look at the source? Why don't you figure out that they haven't done this, right? all of you, I'm putting this, I'm almost done with my career and my life. You are the young people who are going to make the world a better place. I want to inspire you to do these things. Okay. So, you have it in your hands to kind of change the world, right? In small ways. We are not all going to become big leaders and change the world, but you can make change in your own community, in the work you do, in how you teach, in the topics that you teach about, in the research that you do. You can make that change. Okay. So journalism is another area that I think we should work in. My other very big passion is social change. Okay, this is like the thing that I absolutely love. Okay, working to see how communication can be used for social justice issues. All right. And the biggest problem we are facing today is climate change. Right. We have a lot of work being done in health, and it's extremely important, right? But our health is linked to our climate and to our environment. And unless we improve that situation, we are not going to always be able to improve the health situation. Yes. So my second major piece of encouragement to all the people in this audience is please consider looking at environmental communication, right? How can you work or do research or studies in environmental communication for social change? Now, why is this important with the topic of today's talk, which is indigeneity and indigenous people, right? The reason it's important is because, as I told you, the indigenous people's epistemology was relationship with nature, right? They were known to preserve nature, to respect nature. When they took something off of a tree, they thanked the tree for giving them that fruit. They made sure that they did not destroy the tree, because that was the tree that gave them life, right? And I'll tell you a little story. This is a story that comes from Africa. Some of you might be familiar with an activist, an environmental activist. She passed away about 4 years ago. Her name was Wangari Maathai, and she was from Kenya. And she started what's called the Green Belt movement, the movement to plant trees. And when she was a little girl, and I heard this story on National Public Radio, which is a very credible news outlet in the United States, and through a program which does interviews with many different people. So it was about an hour-long interview, and she tells this absolutely lovely story. She says, when she was a little girl growing up in Kenya, I just noticed there's somebody who's got a raised hand, and I will take your question in a moment. There was this tree that all the parents of the children said, never break a branch from this tree. So they would send the children out and say, collect some firewood for us. And the children were told, collect only the firewood and the twigs that have fallen on the ground from this particular tree. Never go to this tree and try to break a small branch off. And the children would ask their mothers, why? You tell us that we can do it for the other trees, but we cannot do it for this tree. And the mothers would say, because God lives in this tree, right? So the children obeyed their mothers, like all good children do. And they grew up always respecting this particular tree. And then the missionaries came to Africa. And again, please understand that I have nothing against any religion. I'm just repeating a story. The missionaries came to Africa And they, converted a lot of these communities into Christianity. So many of these communities became Christian. And one thing that if you study many, many different communities, when Christianity was first introduced to them, and this is across the world, they did not give up their own faith. So they would worship, Jesus Christ, but they would also believe in their own little spirits and their shamans and all of that, right? They would not give that part up. So the missionaries were upset that they still worshipped this tree, even though they had become Christians. So what do you think the missionaries did? They chopped all of these trees down. They were the fig trees. They were a kind of fig tree. And what happened? Mudslides began to happen in those communities, and they couldn't get any fresh spring water. So why were these trees called God by the parents? They were called God not because God actually lived in them, but the roots of that tree were such that they held the land together and they prevented landslides from happening. And the roots also delved into the land, and little springs of fresh spring water would come up, and they would get clean, fresh spring water because of that. So this is what I mean by their epistemology of having respect for nature, where they believe that it is a reciprocal relationship, right? So today in environmental work, many people are realizing that you need to go back to these communities and find out how they preserve the environment. And that's a very rich area for communication research. Okay. And again, I'll give you another example. In the United States, we have a lot of fires which happen all the time, in California particularly, and they don't know how to control them. They're destroying homes. They finally decided to go to the Native Americans in California because they had the knowledge of how to burn small patches of grassland so that fires would not skip. So if you have a huge grassland and you burn part of it, then the fire cannot continue on. And so now they have gone to these people, the Native Americans, to learn how to control fires, right? So there's a tremendous amount of indigenous knowledge. By IK, I mean indigenous knowledge about the environment. And it's a tremendously important area for us to study and to communicate that. How did they interact with the environment? What were their epistemologies? What were their ways of knowing? And include them when you go in to do any kind of social change work with them. Instead of going and saying, I'm the expert, I know how to control the environment, I know how to treat you for your health. Ask them, right? We all know in India, there's tremendous plant knowledge, right? We all grew up eating turmeric every day. And now in the United States, they sell turmeric pills because people have realized here how important turmeric is, right? Haldi, what we call haldi in India, right? So again, I'm talking about indigenous knowledge and their epistemologies as being extremely important for us to understand and to use in environmental communication for social change, or even in health communication for social change, which is another huge, huge area, okay? So here's an example of an article, this one, How to Practice Post-Humanism in Environmental Learning. And this is also, this article has South Asian indigenous communities in it. So I was able to find a few articles and books about South Asian communities, and I'll send all of them to Professor Saxena and to Professor Maheshwari, and they can share with whoever's interested on learning and reading. And my first request to all of you is that read a lot, okay? If you're going to go into this area and it's a new area for you, which is what I'm still learning, I'm still reading constantly, okay? only when you've read a lot and understood it well do you start talking about it. Should I take the question that I think Manaswini Yogi, that's you, Maheshwari, right?
No, ma'am, that's another senior faculty. Manaswini
Okay.
M. Yogi, ma'am, is here. Can somebody give her access?
Good evening, Professor Jyotika Ramaprasad, and everybody at DME.
Before Professor Yogi intervenes, let me introduce her. Jyotika ji, she is a very senior media educator, and she has been in Delhi University till very recently running this department. This is School of Communication there. Yeah. Dr. Yogi, you can please ask a question.
Yeah.
Very nice to meet you, Dr. Yogi.
Thank you. Same here, ma'am. I've taught for 40 years, then retired, and then I was heading Delhi School of Journalism. I found your talk very interesting and very, useful. And I've been also interested in this area, though could not do much research because of, the teaching projects which we had. Just one question I want to ask you, ma'am. You very rightly said, that we should bring these first people, the indigenous people, to the to the limelight and bring them ahead, teach them journalism. And you were suggesting that DME should take a step towards this. But there's one problem, which I've been, however much I've read about them and heard, that, especially in context of the Indian indigenous or Adivasis, they are not very welcoming, about the people whom they consider to be perhaps indigenous for them. They don't want to include us. I saw a film by Mr. Nandan Saxena. It was, I Will Not Give You My Land. This is a film on Adivasis of some tribe in Odisha. That, how people try to bring them and teach them about the, new things, town living, and how they protested. So is it very easy to, draw them out of their cocoons, from their lives, from their environment, and healthy life they are leading in their own, forest or wherever, and bring them to the mainstream? Is it I think it seems to be a little difficult task, because first you have to develop a rapport with them that they don't consider you to be an outsider. Only then they'll even talk to you. Otherwise, they don't even want to talk to you because they feel that we are intruders.
So that's an excellent question and an excellent point. So I actually have an article on that also that I will send about how how sometimes the tables are turned, where the first people are other us. They think we are the other, right? Most of the time, the perspective is that we have othered them. We have discriminated against them. They are those other people who are backward or whatever, but that they also think of us as the other, right? Yes. So there's an article about that too. I didn't have time to include it today in the talk because I collected so much information for the talk, and I decided I didn't want to just talk, and I wanted to converse with all of you too. And so that's absolutely right. Now we have to think for a moment about why they feel that way. Okay, what has been the power base till now? And what has their experience with us been till now? So they're obviously suspicious. They're obviously worried that we are coming to take something from them, right? I'm assuming, I mean, I don't know this group, so what do we do? And Professor Yogi answered the question. You take a very long time to build a rapport, and you don't go there to teach them about town living. You go there to say, what can you teach us? What can you teach us about your way of life? What can you teach us about the forest? What can you teach us about? So go with humility, because what happens is most of us think that we should go in and teach them something. But I think we need to go in saying, what can you teach us? We have much to learn from you and your way of life, right? Yes. And can you please work with us and build that. You were absolutely right, Professor Yogi, that rapport building takes a very long time. So DME is not going to be able to do this tomorrow. It might take them 10 years, but we have to plant a seed at some point. And I'm talking about planting that seed. And we go in and we say that we have, as human beings, destroyed the environment and you have preserved it. What can you teach us today?
True.
Can we then slowly can we do a video where you teach us how you have interacted with the forest and with the animals in the forest, right?
True.
With the birds in the forest. And
True.
that is how they will begin to trust you and respect you. So it's not going to happen overnight. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. And I would request you if you could send the article you were referring to, the link
Certainly.
to Professor Amrish Saxena, and I will take it from him, and I would definitely like to read it and, do something. And because I am also interested in this kind of, you can call it research or study. So that will be very helpful. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. And I was going to make that point that, it's not like we are all bad people. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But we need to realize the power we hold in our hands, each one of us. And that they also now have some of that power to say, well, you are these other people and we don't want to have anything to do with you. And they have a right to say that, just like we have done this to them, right? So this article talks exactly about that. They don't want us. They think we are the other people, right? And so obviously it takes a lot of time. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sure.
If I can add something here, Professor Jyotika, in fact, it's not only in the case of the indigenous people or the tribals, even in the case of any development projects which are taken up by the government for us all. But why I can see this, why most of the projects fail, because there is a trust deficit between those who are sitting in the government and those for whom some development project is being undertaken by the government. The government feels that we are doing, big things for the development of certain sections of the people, but then people do not accept that kind of development the way it's done by the people sitting in power. So that trust deficit has to be bridged. Any kind of development project or any such kind of project is to be taken up wherein we are trying to reach out the indigenous people or the tribal people.
Absolutely, you hit the nail on the head. That's it. I teach an entire course in communication for social change. And I talk about this all the time. And we also have to think about the fact that we define development as economic development, but economic development has destroyed the environment. Capitalism has to some extent been responsible for destroying the environment. And we are all suffering, right? We are all going to have health issues. Right? Look at Delhi and the pollution problem you have. Long term, this is going to create serious health issues, right? So how do we define development also becomes a problem. I review a lot of dissertations for PhD candidates from Pakistan. And I just sent yesterday a report. I reviewed a dissertation and sent my comments back. And the entire discussion, the premise of the dissertation was that new technology enables economic development. And because new technology is prevalent in Punjab, more prevalent in Punjab compared to Sindh, Punjab is more developed. And I sent a critique saying the basic premise is wrong, that you cannot say that, development is only economic development, and new technology without any reservations to say that new technology leads to development. Right? New technology, and I can send you tons of reading on that too, has a lot of flaws in it, and it has created a digital divide, as all of you know. It has created lots of issues of children just doing a lot of social media and not really doing, paying attention to serious news, right? So we can't always think about things as progressive and as new media as being the best medium, right? We have to adopt this. That's another big lecture, which is critical perspective as opposed to an administrative perspective, that we have to be critical in all of this. And so you're absolutely right that when we go in like that and we go in as experts, that is the biggest problem, which is the biggest mistake we make. We don't go in as experts, we go in as partners. In fact, we go in with humility and respect, And I will just very quickly, because I think we're going to be out of time, show you just one thing. I haven't completed my talk, but there's always going to be a lot more that all of us can talk about. I want to show you my course syllabus for 1 second. Just give me a moment. And I want to just show one line from it. So this is when I developed this course. You can see how much I read.
You have to share your screen again, ma'am.
Yes, I will in a moment, okay? Indigenous communication course proposal. Indigenous communication course syllabus. Okay, so I'll just show you this and then I'll stop. So this is the course I've developed. I haven't yet taught it. I'll probably teach it next year sometime, but I want to show you one section of it. This is something that I put in my courses. The values that inform this course are social justice, humility, respect, and interdisciplinarity, right? So I think we need to approach everything from that point of view, right? When we go into any community, we need to understand humility and respect. And this is how I want my courses to be when I teach, is I want to teach with humility. And that's why I also, told you that I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm exploring it with you. And certainly not an expert. I know a lot more about Australia and Canada and America Indigenous communities than I know about South Asia. And I found a lot of articles, but because the talk wasn't that long, I couldn't share everything with you. But this is something we need to adopt in our life and not think of ourselves as experts and powerful. We all have a lot to learn. I tell my students that all the time. I learn from you as much as I teach you, So I just wanted to share that with you. And you can see that, the objectives for learning were, enhance your personal and social responsibility, develop a critical approach, develop a global perspective. I think this is very, very important for our students, right? And, then of course, I would go into each of these areas. Oh, and the other thing which is very important to do in courses is to ask them to do reflections, to reflect on something, to think about it, right? So I first asked them to, in the first class, that reflect on your own dispositions towards Indigenous people. And then at the end of the class, I'll ask them to write the same reflection and see if they changed what they think about Indigenous people, And so here it is, here are the topics, some of which I went through with you, so I started with thinking differently, Why do we study Indigenous communication? Decolonizing indigeneity, and then going to epistemologies, ontologies, axiologies, and so on and so forth. So, that's the basic message, that we always need to approach everyone with humility and respect. Yeah. So, yeah, if there are any more questions or anything in chat, I'm happy.
There are a lot of questions. So whatever time permits, I'll try to take maximum of them. There's one question from Govind. Which research methodologies have been used successfully in culture and communication of Indigenous people studies?
So I think that largely qualitative research works best when you study Indigenous people. So when you begin your studies, if you go in with a quantitative questionnaire, it's what you want, which is not what is the best way to establish that kind of rapport and get really good information. I would recommend that you start just with building rapport even before you talk about research. Then you do like in-depth interviews, or you tell them to tell stories, and then develop and make sure you use their language, right? I mean, make sure you use the way words mean to them is very different, right? From how words mean. Even the English language, meaning in America for certain words is so different from British English meaning, right? So you may use let's say if they understand Hindi, but they may have special words for certain concepts and you want to make sure that you use them. So my recommendation would be start with qualitative. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question from Saima Parvez is what is the correct way to use indigenous knowledge which is available, and further how to use it in health communication for rural India?
You know, that's an excellent question and requires a very long answer. But my first suggestion would be that make sure you, whichever community, remember now the important thing is not to believe that the same thing would apply to all indigenous communities. So you look at the indigenous community you're interested in working with, and you first go in and do the same thing. You find out what their knowledge is. How do they treat certain diseases, or if they are, if they have a little wound, how do they treat it, and so on, right? I didn't finish my slideshow, but there was one on health disparities between indigenous and non-indigenous people. Find out what are the diseases that affect them a lot more than they affect all, people who are not indigenous communities. There are certain diseases that are more prevalent in certain communities. And then you talk to them about their own knowledge and how they deal with it. And then you start developing communication. So when I develop communication, I do what's called formative research. I do a lot of research with the community. What is the best way to communicate with them? I did a project in Vietnam where the only way I could communicate with them was the only media they had was loudspeakers outside of their villages, just outside of their houses, and where the houses were. I had to develop tapes with my messages, and we used to play them every morning and evening, right? So you need to understand what's the best way to communicate with them, and then develop your communication in partnership with them. The project I did in Macedonia, I had an NGO working with the Roma people, and I worked with them, and I had Roma people act in the video. I didn't stand there and say, oh, you should do this or you should do that. I had the Roma people act out this thing. So it's very important to do it in that particular way. I don't know if that answers the question, but first find out what they know, what are the problems in the community, develop rapport, and develop your communication, your health communication in partnership with them, using their way of speaking, the media that they like to watch or listen to, and so on. Okay.
Right.
All right.
So I think that's what you mean throughout your presentation, that if we engage with people, especially when you're dealing with the people, indigenous people, we need to understand their language, and maybe it has to be a lot of engagement with them, and then we can make it our communication more effective. So I'll take last question because there are a lot of, but I don't think we have time to take all the questions. There's one from Vinayak. So he says that how can history of indigenous people help in carving the future of any nation, or it's the development if we see from the perspective of Africa's indigenous tribes? So, their role in development.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? Let me try to answer that first.
How can history of indigenous people help in carving the future of any nation? How their rich culture, and, maybe he wants to know about it.
Right. So I think it's, again, as a researcher, you can make the history of indigenous people prominent by, publishing, by, let's say you go in and do research within a community and find out their history, right? You would have to look at secondary sources also and do some primary research talking to them. After you do the research, make sure you develop some relationship with a journalist and have the media come and talk about that so other people get to know about it. Maybe if there's a policy issue that needs to be addressed, if a lot of journalists write about it, you can go in, maybe some government leader might pay attention to it. Or, maybe there's an NGO that works on their issues and you've discovered something that you want the NGO to address. You go ahead and talk to the NGOs. One of the things I did a lot in South Asia was I would do workshops for NGOs and journalists together. So they got to know each other. Because I would try to tell journalists, cover not the NGO, cover the social issue, right? So cover, like if they're talking about COVID, cover COVID. Don't cover whether the NGO has so much money or doesn't have so much money. That's unimportant. what is the work they're doing? What is the social issue they're doing? So similarly with history, it needs to be, people don't know this, right? Let's do that and let's make it forefront and let's put it out in the media that this is the history of indigenous people. This is, and it's not that they are not destroyed forests and all that. The way we have put pressure on them, they are destroying a lot of things. But, it's important to keep that in mind. And then what was the second part of the question? I can't remember.
In reference to Africa's tribes, he wanted to know if we can talk about their contribution from the perspective of Africa's indigenous tribes. So how can,
Yeah, so they have, I think what is happening in Africa is there's 60 different countries in Africa, and they are all based, almost all of those countries have many, many different tribes, right? So their different work is being done with different tribes, and they're being kind of encouraged in certain areas. For example, if you look at marathon runners in the US, who wins the marathons? It's usually the people from Kenya or from Ethiopia, and it's usually the tribal people, right? As soon as one of those people wins a marathon, it becomes a celebrity in that community who is then going to be able to encourage other people from that particular tribe to actually pursue dreams outside that can lead them to an education or whatever. So, the way to do it is to, quote, enhance the particular attributes of a particular community, right? Not all communities are the same. But the Maasai people in Kenya are extremely long, tall people with long legs. They're excellent runners because of that, right? So what is it that your first people have that can then be used, So there's a lot of other work being done in Africa, and we don't have the time to talk about it, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. And there are a lot of long list of questions. If time will permit, maybe next time, whenever you are coming to our campus, I'm sure soon, so we can talk about it. And now I hand over back to Christina. In the meanwhile, the feedback link for this session has been posted in the chat box. All of you are requested to fill this, and you will get a participation certificate after filling the form. Christina, back to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for such an insightful session. I now request Professor Dr. Sushmita Bala, Head DME Media School and Chief Associate Convener, ICAN5, to give the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Professor Jyotika, for such a lovely talk. In almost all parts of the world, there are people who originally owned the land and who had their own language, culture, customs, dance, and music. In India also, we have tribals who have a rich culture. They have their own communication, who might look like primitive, but which is very rich. Preservation of this language and culture is our responsibility. We can do this by making use of the technology that we have today. I agree with the suggestion given by Professor Jyotika in this regard. At DME also, we can take up such a project. Thank you, Professor Jyotika, once again. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to me. As I said, I'm not an expert. I'm just here to share some thoughts.
No, you are expert, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we come to the conclusion of Masterclass 2. My foremost and heartfelt thanks to the session expert for sharing her valuable insights about the theme Indigenous Peoples Communication, focus on South Asia and covering Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Sincere thanks to management of DME, Aman Sahani, Vice Chairman, Justice Bhavar Singh, Director General, Professor Dr. Ravikant Swami, Director, for their support in every endeavors being taken by DME Media School. Heartfelt thanks to Dean Media School, Professor Dr. Amrish Saxena, Head Media School, Professor Dr. Sushmita Bala, for their motivation in planning and executing the flagship event of Media School. Thanks to Dr. Manasvi Maheshwari, Associate Professor and Associate Convener of ICAN5, for all over coordination for the International Media Conference. Thanks to Sumantra Sarthi Das and Vishal Sahai, Assistant Professor, and Yogesh Sharma, faculty at Media School for digital and production support for ICAN5. Thanks to Dr. Manmeet Kaur, Associate Professor, and Pramod Kumar Pandey, Assistant Professor, for their efforts in supporting ICAN5. Thanks to Shruti VS, Assistant Professor, Media School, for managing technical and cultural team along with student coordination. Mohammad Kamil and Sukriti Arora, Assistant Professor, for newsletter, press briefings, and media coordination support. Dr. Ritika Saxena, Assistant Professor, for designing and creative support. Samya Parvez and Dr. Sumeda for their support with social media management. I also thank Pawan Saxena, Anmol Mehta, Tulika Arora, CM Anand, Abhishek Yadav, Jagan for administrative and logistic support. Student convener Priya Yadav for her consistent support in ICAN5. All student coordinators from newsletter, production, hospitality, anchoring cultural, and digital operation for their coordination and consistent effort for the conference. Thanks to all the researchers, participants who have sent their full research papers for this International Media Conference, participants of various sessions. Special thanks to our conference partner, knowledge partners, international partners, and media partners. Requesting everyone to please turn on their camera for a group photograph. Thank you everyone for joining, and we take your leave now and see you tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. in the workshop on social media, current research trends, chaired by Dr. Aftab Hussain from Daffodil International University, Dhaka, Bangladesh. Thank you everyone. Have a great day ahead.